Okay, hello everyone. I'm Sarah. I'm happy to open this session. And I'm going to put my timer and to present this work, Expanding Access to Schooling in Nigeria and its Impact on Marital Outcomes. So I'm Sarah. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern University and is joint work with Rose and Ott from the University of Tours. So fostering gender equality has become an objective of policymakers for the last 2 or 3 decades, roughly. And there have been 2 broad categories of policies to go around that. Some policies directly target women's empowerment as an objective in itself. But you have at the other end of the spectrum, you have other type of policies for which women's empowerment is actually a byproduct of the policy itself. And that's notably the case of large-scale educational policies that were implemented in South African countries after the independence of colonial powers. The rationale behind those policies is the following. Those large-scale educational policies are intended to increase education, and increased education is then thought to be able to erode restrictive gender norms. So far, when the literature has been studying those questions, they've been focusing on the impact on women's education and women's empowerment, and more specifically between the relationship between women's education and their marital outcomes. And for excellent reason, and one of them is that marriage still plays a crucial role in women's welfare in developing countries. First, because female celibacy is still stigmatized, and as long as women are of fertile age, they are expected to be married. And the second reason is that in contexts where there are little safety net outside of the family, marriage is a key way to have access to resources of the family of the husband. However, those educational reforms pose an interesting challenge, is that they affected usually both the education of men and of women at the same time, meaning that 2 sides of the marriage market are being affected by education policy. And the net effects of those changes are not obvious. And one of the reasons is that South African societies are usually, based on a hierarchy, based on gender, on an age. And it's not obvious that even a more educated husband will welcome the challenge that may come with more women's empowerment. And so that's the question that we're addressing in this paper. In this paper, we are going to use a policy that increased primary education in Nigeria, and we are going to study whether it led women to form more gender-equal unions after the reform, and we'll define a more gender-equal union, where a situation where husband and wife has a lower age gap, which has been shown by demographers working in South Africa to be a good proxy for gender inequality within the couple. However, for the sake of time, for this presentation, I'm going to mainly focus on the results on other aspects of marital welfare of women, and notably whether women who are more educated are more or less tolerant of domestic violence, whether they are more involved in decisions taken in the household, and the experience of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, that I may call IPV in the rest of the presentation. And then we are going to answer another question, which is the direction of the effect of women's education similar at the effect of husband's education? And to do that, you are going to use the 1976 Universal Primary Education Program, or UPE, that was implemented in Nigeria. And we are going to use a difference in difference. We are going to compare women who were of primary school age before and after the beginning of the reform. And we are going to compare their outcomes in localities where the intensity of the investment made for the program were high, compared to localities where those intensity was low. And we are also going to leverage an interesting feature of the marriage market in West Africa, which is the high age difference between partners, which is an average of 10 years. And so conceptually, we are going to use 3 cohorts. Cohorts where none of the partners are treated, 1 cohort where the wife is treated but the husband is not, and then other where both partners are treated to make the difference between women's education and husband's education. So just to give you a bit of context, or there are many Africanists in the room, so I'm going to be quick. Nigeria is currently a federation of 36 states and 774 local government areas, which is the locality at which we are going to measure the intensity of the treatment. Of course, it's the most populated country in Southern Africa with 200 million inhabitants and maybe even more, according to the latest census. And so it's a country that is very rich in terms of ethno-linguistic group, religion, but it's also a country that is fractured and usually along a north-south divide. So on this map, you can see the gray area, the states that are considered in the north administratively, and in the white one, the states that are considered to be in the south. And for the question that we're interested in, there are 2 key differences that we are actually going to develop here. First is the difference in the level of education in the north compared to the south, and in the functioning of the marriage market. So before the policy in 1976, 55% of people had not completed primary education with a discrepancy in terms of gender. 39% of men had not completed primary education, but 65% of women. In terms of years of education, translated in overall 5 years of education, 7 years for men, which was corresponding to completing a whole cycle of primary school, and 4 years for women. On this map, I plotted the share of women who had not completed primary school before the beginning of the policy. The darker the shade of blue, the higher this share of women who had not completed primary education. And what you can see, there are two main takeaways. The first one is that there are more women who are likely to be educated in the north compared to the south of the country, but we still have variation at the local government area level, which is the unit that is represented here on this map. And if I were to show you the same map for men, it would be the same message, just, with a lower level. So the reason for this divide in North and South very quickly are related to what happened pre-colonization, where, so there are more Muslim groups in the north of the country compared to the south, and they had a strong tradition of Quranic education in the north in the way that the animists of the south didn't have. And so those differences were then enhanced by British colonization in the sense that the British somehow implemented, at least in the beginning, some indirect rule in the north, which led them to discourage the implementation of missionary school in the north, whereas they did not at all have this policy in the south, where you have more missionary school implemented. And that kind of, already set up the gap between the Western type education take-up in the north compared to the south of the country. So now the second key aspect for us is the question of the marriage market. So some key features: timing of union, of first union differs by gender, is characterized by an early entry for women at 16 in the north on average compared to 20 in the south, and the late entry of men at 26 on average. And that allows for several things. The first thing is a matching between partners belonging to distant generation, hence the 10-year age gap that we have in the data, and also to favoring the prevalence of polygamy, again with those differences in the north and the south, because it's 46% in the north compared to 20% in the south. So the policy itself, the 1976 Universal Primary Education Program, was implemented by the military government or Lieutenant General Obasanjo. It's a nationwide program that had two legs and started in 1976. The first one was it made primary education free, but not mandatory. The second one is that they built a high number of classrooms. And the rationale for the policy was to have the regions that were lagging behind to catch up with the most advanced ones. So more resources were directed to areas with the lower enrollment. The program, or at least, the free primary part of the program, ended in 1981 because of the lack of resources. So just to give you an idea of the push, this is a number of public and private schools that were founded since independence, and I borrowed this graph from Larragee and Marshall, and you can see a strong push in the number of schools built around 1976. So to answer the research question that we have in mind, we're going to geolocalize demographic and health survey for Nigeria, and we put 4 waves together. And we're going to focus on women who are married and in their first union and who are aged 15 to 49, and men aged 18 to 59. And we're going to match their location, the DHS location, at the local government area level. We are going to look at, outcomes of the tolerance of domestic violence, which is measured with questions such as, do you find it justifiable for a husband to beat his wife? In 5 different scenarios, women say yes or no, and we aggregate the answer by summing the binary answers to the question. We do a similar thing for whether women are involved in decisions taken in the household, and the same thing for the experience of domestic violence. Now, estimation strategies, the difference and difference, they are going to use 2 sources of variation. So first, the cohort of birth of women. So we know that entering primary school happens at 6 years old, and the UPE started in 1976. So we are going to define women who are exposed to UPE as equal to 1 for women born between 1970 and 1975, and 0 for women born between 1960 and 1965. We are also going to use a placebo cohort to test, the credibility of the parallel trend assumption. The second dimension that we use are the intensity of the investment made at the local government area level for the policy. And to do that, remember, so the rationale was that more investments were made in areas lagging behind in terms of enrollment. And so we borrowed the measure of Larregi and Marshall, who worked on this policy as well, but on the impact of civic participation. And we are going to use the measure of intensity, which is basically the measure of the potentiality of the reform. And so it's going to be 1 minus the share of women who at baseline had completed primary school. So it means that a high baseline enrollment, if there is a high baseline enrollment, the intensity is actually going towards 0, right? Because if you have a lot of women who already had completed primary school, the intensity is going to be lower because you expect less investment to be made in those areas. And so that will be a low intensity. But if there was a low baseline enrollment, the intensity of the program is expected to be higher because we know that more investment were made so as to, for those regions to catch up with the ones that were actually at a higher level. So it's a difference and difference, a very classical one. So we are going to use the outcome, and we are, I'm going to, for the sake of time, go a bit faster. So going to the outcome for women I in cohort C in state S in local area L, interview that time T. What we're interested in, so is beta 2, the coefficient, for the double difference, and we control for state fixed effect, individual controls, including religion, whether women live in an urban area, and also the ethno-linguistic group. We add survey fixed effect, and we also, allow our outcome to vary differently across, to have this linear time trend across states with this term delta S by POSI for some state cohort trends. And we cluster our standard errors at the local government area level. So a very quick word on the threats to validity. So we know with the pattern assumption would be violated if factors unrelated to UPE also affected marital outcomes differently in treated and control groups over time. So a key suspect here is the Biafran war that happened before the beginning of our policy and that could have led to gender imbalances on the marriage market that are actually hard to anticipate, but that could bias a result. So other papers have looked at the impact of UPE notably and somehow, on the impact of the war on age at marriage, typically Akrash and co-authors, and they find no impact on age at marriage. And also, just to be safe, we also test whether our results are robust to dropping the Southeast regions where the fights and the blockade that lead to more death actually were concentrated. And, to make sure that any other programs of structural change that may improve women's marital outcomes are not happening here or confounding our effect, we include this state-specific cohort trend. For the second time, let me move to the rest. Another issue could be migration. We localize women in the current place of residence. We know that 23% of respondents are not born in the location where they were surveyed. We are going to use that to do a bounding exercise with migration. But overall, we are confident that it won't be so much of an issue because 3/4 of, immigration is either between rural or between urban areas, which kind of, tended to have some similar level of baseline intensity. So what do we find? So here we are plotting, the yearly effect of the policy on women's years of education, with our last, the last cohort non-treated being 1965. So for women born between 1966 and 1969, they are not included in the analysis, but for the sake of transparency, we show here what's going on for them. And we also already see an increase in education, but it's probably related to the fact that there is a lot of late entry into schooling. For the cohorts that we're interested in, so for women born between 1970 and 1985, we see a clear change in the trend in terms of years of education with an increase in their years of education. For men, we have some similar scenario that is happening here. So for the sake of time, let me resume what we find in terms of education, and notably in the south compared to the north of the country. So we find that for 1 standard deviation increase in the intensity of the treatment, women's education increased by 2 years in the south, men's education by 1.4 years. And in the north of the country, women's education increased by 0.7 years, and men's education by 2.4 years. So women's education in the north may still seem like a modest increase, but the baseline level is not even 2 years. So it is a significant increase in women's education still, even though it may seem more modest than in the south of the country. So again, we wanted to leverage this age gap between partners so as to disentangle the impact of the education of the husband versus the education of the wife. And so we have those 3 cohorts that I'm going to describe here. So we have, our control cohorts where none of the partners are treated, right? So the wife is not exposed to UPE and the husband is not exposed to UPE. Then we have cohort A, where women is exposed to the policy, but the husband is not. And then cohort B, where both partners are treated. And in the next estimation, what I'm going to do is that I'm going to take A and B, so cohorts A and B together, and I'm going to compare them with my control group. And that is going to give me the overall impact of the policy regardless of the education of the husband. And that will be beta 2. And then I'm going to compare cohort B and cohort A, and that will give me the additional effects of the education of the husband compared to just treating the wife, and that would be beta 3. And so in the equation, I'm just a bit advanced on that. And so just, there might be some, you could think that there is some issue thinking that, if there is an increase in education, maybe there would be some sorting on the marriage market, and the age gap with the partner is going to actually change. So to treat that, what we do is we do a small simulation exercise where when we define the treatment for women, we define the probability that she's married to a fictitious husband who is born after 1970, as if treated women were marrying husbands with the same age gap as women in the control group. And that allows us to keep the age gaps fixed, both on the right-hand side of the equation, and to avoid some weird simultaneity bias when we look at our estimation. So then again, we're going to look at the same difference, but this time we have this additional term, so pose for intensity by score, and we're going to look at beta 2 and beta 3, which are going to be the effect that we're interested in. So for the second time, I move directly to what's going on in the south of the country in terms of women's marital welfare. So if you look at beta 2 first, so this coefficient here, so for the south, what it means is that a straightforward way to read it would be to say that if the intensity of the treatment was going from 0 to 1, it would mean that the index of tolerance of domestic violence in the south would decrease by -1, which is a huge effect given the baseline. However, given, how the intensity of the treatment is actually changing, descriptively, it makes more sense to rescale those coefficients by the standard deviation in the intensity of the treatment, which is 0.3. And then it means that for one standard deviation increase in the intensity of the program, tolerance of IPV decreased by a third, which is a sizable effect. And when you look at beta 3, so here what we find is that there is an additional effect of, having a husband who is also educated compared to just having a wife who is educated, as it further decreased the tolerance of IPV by 6%. Why 6%? Because we have to rescale this coefficient by both the standard deviation of the intensity of the treatment and the standard deviation of the score of the husband, which is 0.2. Now, in the south of the country, when it comes to behavior and decision-making, what we find is that there is an increase in women's involvement in decision-making, with, overall, regardless of the education of the husband, but no additional effects of having a husband who is educated as well. In the north of the country, the story is a bit different. We find no overall effect of UPE, but we find that when both partners are treated, we find a decrease in women's tolerance of domestic violence, which represents 5%, so a more modest effect compared to what we see in the south. And we find no change in women's involvement in decision-making. So overall, what we find is that women are better off as a result of the policy, but the mechanics of the effect seems to be differing. In the south, it seems to be the result of the combined effect of wife and husband's education, whereas in the north of the country, for us to see improvement, it seems to need to be unlocked by the education of the husband. So again, we may wonder, what do we make of those differences? So when it comes to support for more gender equal norms for the tolerance of domestic violence, women and men's education seems to go in the same direction. But when empowerment is lower at baseline, like in the north of the country compared to the south, husband's education seems to be a critical factor in improving women's outcome. When it comes to behavior, so the involvement in decision-making, a key difference between the north and the south of the country is the change in the age gap of partners that I wasn't able to show for the sake of time, but the age gap with the partner decreases by 1.7 years in the south of the country. And that is consistent, in our opinion, that for us to have improvement in behavior, it needs to trigger a change in the relative position or relative hierarchy within the couple between spouses. So a quick word of mechanism, because I have 1 minute. So of course, we look at, what could mediate those effects. So of course, there's one aspect, the characteristics of the husband. We looked at that empirically. We found little change in the north, meaning there's no change in the age gap, very little change in the education gap with the partner and other aspects. In the south, we find that the age gap between partner decreases, which means, that what we find are just changes in the characteristics of the husband beyond pure compositional effects of the population as an effect of the policy. You could think that the education of the wife directly could actually have an impact on those results by increasing her bargaining power. She could get better at tasks that, she are devolved to her within the household. So it could be a case, but it's also true that because a huge number of pupils started primary school as well as a result of the policy and completely, went beyond what the government actually planned, there was actually evidence of a decrease in the quality of education. So we're not 100% sure we can answer, about that aspect of mechanism, but let's say that given this question about quality of education, it's kind of a bit up in the air. You can think that women have better upside options by the labor market. However, Oyelere actually showed in a paper using this exact same policy that the labor market outcomes or the returns to education in the labor market were only 3% per year in terms of additional income, whereas what you usually expect is around 11%. So it was disappointing on that front, and that's why we do not believe that it's a main factor here. You could think that the husband being more educated leads to him being more progressive, but the answer is not clear-cut. In the north, we found no change in the husband's tolerance of domestic violence or in his tendency to share decision-making with the wife. In the south, we see some improvements along those lines, so this could play. And, for the same reason as earlier, this question of the labor market outcome of the husband, I don't think we could revisit, but we're kind of confident that it's not going to be the main channel here. So to conclude, we find that large-scale educational programs may improve gender equality in marriage, but unevenly. But it could, boost gender equality in higher empowerment contexts. So educational policy may remain better off in terms of marital welfare, either through their own education and their husbands in higher empowerment contexts, but in lower empowerment contexts, men's education or husband's education is to play a critical role. And those, results also speak to the relevance and the importance of policies targeting both men and women in order to improve women's empowerment. Thank you. Sorry, I do the pointer.
Okay, Sarah. This one? Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Sarah. I mean, it was really fun reading your paper, and I learned a lot. So what I'm going to do today, I'm going to briefly... Oh, sorry about this one here. Yeah, okay, well, yes, here. Okay. Yeah, right. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just briefly tell a little bit what they do, and then I will continue with 3 major suggestions, 3 strengths, and some minor points, okay? So first, what they do, so they do a fantastic job. I think they try to answer the question of how education, looking at women's and men's education, affect marriage. That's my reading, right? I mean, and then they continue with a second step that is bringing a new aspect, that is looking at women's empowerment. And to do so, they profit from universal increase, accessibility or supply of education in primary education in the 70s in Nigeria. And they use a difference in difference, and they exploit the spatial difference between the north and the south. Okay? So what they find that indeed there is an increase in the educations in both women's and men's education, and then they observe this positive impact in empowerment. Okay? So some strengths. I think that the study is very relevant, and so far, following my naive perspective, I think they are bringing something new in trying to disentangle how bringing additional education to women and men affect, and how this will be important. Okay, so I think they provide an extensive discussion on the interpretation of the results, the potential mechanisms, and there is an important policy implication. Okay, that could be even some external validity for other countries where they implemented as well universal education. Some major points. So the first one is going to be connected with the identification strategy. The second one with one potential threat, that is the current conflict, and then is the framing. Okay. So about the identification strategy. So I think I understood much better now that you explained a little bit more about the intensity. So the definition of how each municipality was exposed to this policy is based on their previous characteristics, right? So in that case, high intensity areas are those municipalities where the share of women or men are not completed primary school is above the median of the intensity, and the opposite for the low intensity municipalities, okay? So this is the differences in the baseline, okay, of the universal policy. Some suggestions here. So why not to use, I don't know if you, I don't know if the dummy is a dummy variable or is a continuous variable. It's a continuous variable, so don't forget about this suggestion. So I was thinking about a continuous variable or even calculating with the median within each stage. Okay, I don't know if it's, well, you could answer this later on. And discuss a little bit more on why we observe this evidence. It is endogenous, it's exogenous, so that would be very nice. And I think the reader could profit from this additional discussion. And some alternative measures for capturing the intensity will be looking at the number of schools, just to see if there is some correlation between the pre-treatment characteristics before the treatment and the actual intervention, right? That is just looking at the number of schools that were actually built in each municipality, or even the funding on the investment for each municipality. Okay, what else about the specification? So the goal of the paper is try to evaluate how the education affects marriage, or even the characteristics of the sorting of the marriage. So what you use is a treatment is the intensity, and then you try to control for cohort fixed effect. You include the state fixed effect, and as well the timing of each survey. But what I think is that when you control for the cohort fixed effect, you are not exploiting the variation between cohort exposed and not exposed to the treatment. So I was thinking, I was thinking about previous baseline specification where indeed the treatment is being exposed and not exposed to the policy. So it would be born before the 1970 or before 1970 or after 1970, and then you add the intensity, that is the intensity to the treatment. Okay, so that's why I just included this suggestion here, that is simply trying to forget about the cohort fixed effect and just including what you include here, right? That is the timing of the survey and the state fixed effect. So at the end of the day, you will try to compare individuals that are born or they have the same age at the same state, and you compare cohorts that are exposed and not exposed to the policy. Maybe you already implemented this baseline specification, and there might be some reasons behind you decide to go for the other one. About the spatial heterogeneity, what I think is very interesting, and if there is one important reason behind that is justified by the roots, historic roots behind. So, but I think why not to include an interaction dummy instead of dividing by subsample? Why? I mean, just for the sample size and some statistical power. And it would be nice if you could justify a little bit more if this is an official administrative division or is yourself. It's over? Okay. So I will give you more comments later. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to continue then with my presentation.
Maybe I can answer just a couple of points very quickly before moving to the question. Is it working? Yes. Yeah, okay, so. can you just, sorry,
Yes, sorry, I mean,
yeah, just about the specific, I mean, it's eventually, I mean, it's just that it's kind of, so if you drop the, did you start with the effect of UP? No, so yeah, so the intensity of the measure is constant within LGA, but not across space, so that's how we get our additional source of variation. Basically, when I showed you the map at the beginning with the different levels of education at LGA, that's also the geographical variation that we explored, that's the one. So there is, not, I mean, that's wasn't an issue. And then, so I'm not sure for the second specification you suggest, so your using zeta A would be the cold fixed effect, because I mean, I'm not sure then, you know, would just be the beta 1 on UP, and this one would just be collinear, so I guess they would, one of the terms would drop, I guess, automatically. And maybe for the, for the choice for education and the drivers of the difference, I mean, for sure we would actually look at some things that you...
But I'm happy to share all the slides.
Yeah, we can talk about it.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Well, maybe, I mean, the room will have some questions as well. No? Okay. Shall I continue with my presentation, continue with the discussion, and maybe some people will continue with some questions? I don't know. You are the one deciding, so.
You can read it. Go ahead.
Okay, I will continue with my presentation, and feel free to ask Sarah all the questions at the end. Okay? Great. So this is mine. Perfect. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is very related with Sarah's paper. What I'm going to do in this project, I look at women's marriage market and how they respond when an important share of the population leave the marriage market. Okay? But the first question is why we should care. So we know that marriage early in life is related to poor education, labor and health outcomes for women and their children. But despite his huge cost, marriage below the age of 18 is still widespread in developing countries. And in particular, women in conflict-related and disaster-prone countries can be particularly vulnerable. Why? Because conflict and disaster is a drop in their household financial capacity, but also they have led to the relocation of already 100 million individuals worldwide. Okay? So, looking at the literature, growing attention has been devoted to study early marriage. But however, little is known on what is the impact of these shocks that trigger large population outflows on the age of marriage for women. And one possible explanation behind is because it's hard to identify population changes that is exogenous to the marriage market. So this is the question that I tackle in this project. How I used large earthquakes in Indonesia from 1994 to 2014. And on top of that, I built a novel georeference panel dataset at the age level that provide me with two main features. First, I'm able to track individuals over time. I'm able to track the evolution of women until they actually get married. And second, I identified how each household was affected by an earthquake and their intensity in their own household. Okay? So combining these two features, I exploit the plausibly exogenous variation in the timing and location of the earthquake within an Indonesian provinces to conduct two main analyses. First, I compare young women from the same cohort, age and province, who are exposed and not exposed to an earthquake in a difference in difference specification. And I find that earthquakes increase women's early marriage compared to those women that are not exposed to an earthquake. Second, I also evaluate if differential marriage patterns exist between women that migrate due to an earthquake versus those that are also exposed to an earthquake but are left behind. Okay, so to do so, I benefit from an additional feature of my data set that allow me to follow individuals over time and across space. And I employ a very simple approach, that is adding an interaction if migrating due to an earthquake. What I find, so it seems that the migration is even an additional effect because the impacts are stronger for those women that migrate due to an earthquake compared to those that stay in the areas affected. Okay? But let me clarify. While this paper does not estimate the causal effect of forced migration on the age of marriage, I do my best, using the data that I have, to partially rule out some important threats for my empirical specification. First, I use the location of its household to show that indeed the migration decisions is driven by how each household was exposed to the same earthquake. But still, I'm aware that when I compare women that are exposed to an earthquake, and once they are migrating and once they are left behind, many unobservable biases. Okay, so to do so, to try to affront this limitation, I compare women versus their siblings. And why it is important? Because it allows me to control for family attribute, networking capital, religion, and other aspects. Okay? What happened here? Yeah. So one question here is, why do we see this effect? And what I'm going to do today, I'm going to use the conceptual framework that derives from the model. I will use empirical evidence and the policy implications that emerge from this finding to tell you why we see this additional effect. Because women's marriage is a vital coping strategy against their migration. Okay? So what I'm going to do for the following slides, I'm going to give you some details about the setting, then I will continue with the data, and the basic roadmap in one presentation. So, as I said, what I do in this project is I look at women's marriage market in Indonesia, and I use large earthquakes. So let me tell you a little bit about the about the marriage market in Indonesia, and then I will continue with the earthquake. So the average age of marriage for women is 22. But still, there is some variation across space. But what is important to highlight here that 1 out of 4 women marry before the age of 18, where the legal framework or the legal age at marriage during my time framework is 16 for women and 19 for men. Okay? But what we can see in this age distribution is that there is some variation between female and male individuals. Okay? But why Indonesia is important is because there is some within country variation in the traditional engagement or the traditional practices around the marriage. Okay? So let me highlight a couple of them. So first, there is a variation across between ethnic groups in if they receive or not receive a payment at the moment of the marriage. And this payment is from the groom to the bride. And second, there is also a variation in where the husband ends up after the marriage. So the predominant tradition is the patriarchality, that it means that is the wife who joins the husband community. But still, there is a minority of the ethnic groups that is the opposite direction, that is the husband that joins the wife's community, and this is going to be important to explain the mechanisms behind this paper. Okay, what else? So why earthquakes are important to answer my research questions? Indonesia is one of the countries that is highly exposed to earthquakes given its location on the Ring of Fire. And this feature allowed me to exploit 21 earthquakes from 1994 to 2014. How I define large earthquakes, I use the definition provided by Gignaud and Menendez, where they define large earthquakes as an earthquake where there was a ground shaking of at least 7 in some of its location affected. But what is the nice aspect about earthquakes is that in theory, within a given province, the timing and the location of the epicenter is unpredictable. And today I will provide you some evidence to support this assumption. What else? So why earthquakes? Because earthquakes trigger the outmigration of thousands of individuals. That is going to be important to capture the effect that this project is interested in. What about my data? So I mentioned at the beginning that I built a novel georeference panel dataset, and to do so, I combined 3 main surveys. So to capture the marriage data, I used the Indonesia Family Life Survey. This is a well-known longitudinal level survey at the individual level that has been conducted for the last 21 years, well, even more, 21 years. And there are 2 aspects that I exploit. So first, I use the current and retrospective marriage behavior. Why? Because this information enabled me to track women until and after they get married. So using this information, I designed an ASAR model that is a new, I resaved my data set 8 by 8, where it starts from the age of 12. That is the first time women are at risk of getting married until the actual age of entering the marriage market for the first time. What else? I use the current and retrospective migration behavior that, as I mentioned at the beginning, it enables me to follow individuals over time and across the space. On top of that, I know the GPS location of each household. I have socio-demographic characteristics. I know if they change from one household to another household and the transfer that they receive at the moment of the marriage. Okay? But still, even if I use the current payment and the movement from one household to the other, it might be endogenous, not only to the earthquakes, but also to their migration. So to try to circumvent this potential limitation, I use historical and ethnographic information on the variation in the traditions that happen around the marriage. This variation is at the ethnic group, and it comes from the ethnographic atlas. What else? So the earthquakes data comes from the United States Geological Survey. It's a geolocated survey that, on top of having information on where the epicenter strike, I know as well the ground shaking generated by the same earthquake in its particular location. So you remember that I said that I have the GPS location of each household. So this information allows me to spatially link the location of each household with the ground shaking created by each earthquake. Okay? But what about the empirical strategy? So to present the empirical strategy, I'm going to give you a simple intuition, and then I will present how I formalize this intuition. So to answer my research question, that is, what is the impact of shocks that trigger large population outflows on the age of marriage for women, I exploit 2 sources of variation. First is the within province variation in the occurrence of an earthquake. So let me use an example. So imagine that there is an earthquake in 2010. So in the province, in the polygon, in the red polygon, what we can see, there are some municipalities affected by the earthquake and other municipalities that are not affected by the earthquake. And this is the first variation that I'm going to use. Second, what else? I'm going to use the within cohort and age variation in the exposure to an earthquake. I'm going to continue with my example. Imagine 2 women, A and B, that were born in 1995. So in 2010, they were both 15 years old. So what I'm going to do for this project, I'm going to compare woman A, that is exposed to an earthquake, versus woman B, that is not exposed to an earthquake. And I'm going to replicate this exercise at a larger scale. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to compare exposed versus not exposed to an earthquake. And in my sample, I have 69% of the women exposed to an earthquake versus only 31% that are not exposed to an earthquake. And how I formalize this intuition? So I use a panel data set that is at the age level. What I'm going to do, I'm going to regress my outcome of interest, that is 1, if woman I in subdistrict S from cohort K get married at the age of A, 0 otherwise, and I regress this outcome on my treatment, that it switches to 1 from the occurrence of an earthquake. I include province fixed effect, year of birth fixed effect, age fixed effect, and urban fixed effect. Why? Because different probability of getting married at different age, and as well, the marriage market behave differently between urban and rural settings. I include individual level covariates that are before the earthquake, and I cluster my error term at the district level. Okay? What else? What about my results? So I'm gonna solve today 2 main findings. First, how earthquakes affect the timing of marriage for women. And then I will continue with how different are the results between those that migrate and those that stay in the areas affected. Okay? So in this table, I saw that indeed being exposed to an earthquake increased early marriage. Okay? And what we can see in column 3 is not restricting my definition to the age of 12 to the age of 18. So in that case, being exposed to an earthquake from the age of 12 to the age of 22 increased the probability of getting married the same year by 7 percentage points. But what happened when I restrict the panel dimension of my data set and I restrict the definition until the age of 18? What we can see is that the results are very in line, but however, the magnitude of the effect corresponds to a 44% in the probability of early marriage. Okay? But of course, there is an important key identifying assumption. That is that earthquakes should not be correlated to the characteristics of the marriage market. So to try to provide some supporting evidence for this identification assumption, I saw that earthquakes take place all around the country, right? So I'm happy to discuss these results if you are interested. But on top of that, I saw that there is no pretrend in the outcome variable. And I just implement a basic event study where we can see that there is no difference in the pre-treatment outcome. What else? I continue with the basic difference in difference robustness checks implemented in Martin.Foy, San and Abraham. Then I will continue what happened when I drop migrants just to estimate the effect of an earthquake in the probability of early marriage, balance sample, the definition of the treatment, sanity checks, and among other robustness checks. And what else? As I mentioned at the beginning, I said that I also evaluate if differential marriage patterns exist between women that migrate due to an earthquake and those that stay in the areas affected. Okay? So to do so, I just add an introduction if migrating due to an earthquake. And what do I find? I find that the impacts are 72% stronger for women that migrate due to an earthquake compared to those that stay in the areas affected. Okay? But remember, I wouldn't like to claim that this is a causal effect. But still, I want to show some robustness checks that I try to implement to overcome potential limitations. So first is a standard check, that is the self-selection into migration. And how I do so? So first I saw that earthquakes indeed increase the probability of migrating by 49% compared to the baseline mean. Importantly, the probability of migrating is uncorrelated to gender, ethnicity, and religion. And on top of that, I saw that a potential marriage does not affect the migration probability. And how I measure potential marriage, I have data on the well-known phenomenon that is the marriage migration. That is a phenomenon where men, they migrate in order to get married. I have data about that, and I saw that the results hold completely. And what else? So given that I have the GPS location of each household, I know how each household was affected by the same earthquake. Okay? So I saw that the probability of migrating is positively correlated with the ground shaking intensity by an earthquake, as you can see on the figure number 5. And in line with the first result that I'm showing here, another proxy to capture the probability. Sorry, I don't know what happened. Yeah, sorry, I don't know. I didn't know that it was. Okay, anyway. So to capture that is exposed to an earthquake is the distance to the epicenter. And I saw that it is negatively correlated. Okay? What else? So I continue with including family fixed effect, and I saw that the results hold when I compare women versus their sisters, and it allowed me to control for other important characteristics that could be correlated with the marriage market. So you remember that I mentioned family attribute, networking capital, culture, religion, and on top of that, one major threat in this paper might be that my estimates could be driven by the characteristics of the new destination. Okay, and I saw that my results are not driven by the destination or the selection of the destination. And how I do so? I saw that indeed 7 out of 10 of my sample migrate within the same district. But what is the administrative division in Indonesia is a province is divided into different districts and a district into different sub-districts. And importantly, it's the 72% of the women migrate within their traditional ethnic homeland, right? So it seems that the ethnicity is an important driver in deciding the destination. And I saw that the development and the composition at the destination does not affect my results. Okay, so I'm going to be quick on that. I continue with some robustness checks, but let me explain the mechanism behind these results. So what I'm going to do to conclude my presentation, I'm going to show you the channels behind the results for women that migrate due to an earthquake, and I will end up with 2 points on the mechanisms that explain the results for those that stay in the area. Okay? So to explain the first mechanism for those that migrate due to an earthquake, let me use a conceptual framework that derives from the model. I'm going to use another example. So you remember this earthquake in 2010? So imagine a household in Indonesia that is a developing country that is exposed to unexpected migration, driven this unpredictable earthquake. And this migration dropped their income, and on top of that, it decreased the local networks at destination. So there are 3 main challenges that could explain these results, because marriage is a vital coping strategy against the migration shock. And to explain this drop in their income and the local network, I'm good at time? I'm done?
Yes, you can go to it.
That is, it's over the time.
It's already 22.
Okay, yeah, so just let me highlight that it's connected with the transfer at the moment of the marriage, then connected with the multi-local tradition and the social integration, okay? So, yeah, sorry about that. I thought I got better in time. Okay, so just let me conclude. Let me just finish with highlighting that if that is the case, if marriage is responding to an economic incentive, how policy could address this economic incentive? So I used unconditional cash transfer as a policy, and I saw that it mitigates the effect. Okay, so happy to discuss other results in case you are interested. Thank you.
So I really enjoyed reading this paper. Thank you very much. So because first I thought that the research question is highly policy relevant, especially in the context with earthquakes and especially natural disasters are becoming more and more common. I got a bit scared.
Can you use the mic?
Okay. Can you hear me now? And now?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. I must say that I got scared in the beginning by the 130 pages, but then I thought that they were totally justified because it is a really dense paper and I learned many things. So yes, thank you for that. And also I think that so you did not mention this in your presentation, but I think the big value added of your paper is that you're not only exposing the consequences on marriage on Earth of earthquake, but also to what you're trying to measure, to what extent a policy response such as UCT can address this. So my main comment would be about the assumption you're making about households' decision timing, since the whole story is about the idea that households experience an earthquake and consequently they make a decision to migrate, and when they are in the new place, they decide to marry one of their daughter in order to smooth their income or increase their social network. But I thought that marriage decision might precede and condition marriage decisions, since households might totally decide to leave or to stay depending on the marriage opportunities they have in their own town. So apparently you addressed that as you said in your presentation, but I guess that in the paper you should insist a bit more on this because yeah, I think maybe it's just one sentence or two. And also, yeah, that's why my idea was maybe it would be interesting to investigate to what extent the likelihood to migrate depends on whether households belong to an ethnic group which practice matrilocality or bride price. Yes, I had also one concern about inverse causality, because, for instance, you show that so household which has migrated, they join social groups which are arisen, and you're explaining that it is a hint of the fact that marriage responds to a motive of expanding social network, but I just thought that maybe the fact of knowing more people in the new place simply increased the probability to find a potential family, a potential groom. And about the BC, the balance check table, so they were a large share of socioeconomic characteristics which varies between the treatment and the control, and especially along characteristics which are highly correlated with the outcome. For instance, the percentage of girls married at baseline, which are higher in the control group, and the fact that treated girls are twice as likely to have a female sibling, and it might suggest an alternative mechanism, and it would be nice to have maybe a short discussion on to what extent it weaken or not your identification strategy. And finally, so my last point was again about the marriage migration, since I think you're mentioning this concept, and I would have needed a more explanation on the definition. How did you build it, and how the negative impact you find on this is reconcilable with the whole positive impact on marriage. So time for question.
I answered you, so I wait for some questions. Yeah, I should have waited. Questions? Yeah, it seems that everything was clear, even if I couldn't say this. Okay. Yeah, so let me answer your question. So, about how traditions could affect probability of migrating. I look at that in the sense that for me it's important for this paper to show that there is not demographic characteristics connected to the marriage market that are important in deciding if migration or not. That's why I said that it's not connected to gender, it's not connected to ethnicity, that is the characteristic that decide their engagement in traditional norms. But on top of that, I saw as well that the probability of migrating is not correlated with being traditionally engaged in bride price or being traditionally engaged in multi-local polygamy as well, but it's a fair point. Thanks for that. What else? About the reverse causality. This is something that I was as well concerned about, and that's why I brought this concept that is the marriage migration. What does it mean? So in the paper I defined, I think I failed completely today in defining what is marriage migration. So it's a phenomenon that is quite common in other Southeast Asian countries, in particular in India, where there is a migration that is it's a migration where the population that migrates, we are trying to search for a marriage. So the main factor behind the migration is the marriage, right? And I have data on the reasons of why they migrate, and one of the reasons is for getting married. So I use this information to define another, as you said, outcome that is marriage migration. And I saw that indeed there is no this reverse causality, so I rule out this potential threat. What else? About the mechanisms, this one I was not very clear, but maybe we could discuss later on. But thanks for your comments.
You're very even a little away. Yeah, can you move the mic?
Là où il était avant, mais plus au milieu, je pense que ça sera plus direct.
Là, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I'm Mathilde, I'm a PhD student, and I'm about to present you a paper which is joint work with Alathea Donald, who is here, Marcus Goldstein, and Trisha Krockneck-Palus. So the title is The Fertility Impact of Development Programs. So high fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa have become a major issue of concern. First, because fertility in the region is the highest in the world, with an average of 4.6 births per woman in 2019, compared to 2.4 globally. In addition, fertility rates are declining more slowly than in other regions, and observers predict a demographic explosion with an African population which would be multiplied by 2 to reach 2.5 billion inhabitants by 2050 and 4.2 billion by 2100. So there are growing concerns among African policymakers that this very dynamic demographic growth would compound the child dependency ratio, which is associated with low educational attainment, poor development, low living standards. In this context, policymakers have attempted mainly to tackle the demographic dividend with supply-side approaches. That is to say, with policies which improve the access to family plannings, to cheaper contraception, better access to health centers, etc. However, evaluation of such programs has shown limited impact on fertility rates, which suggests that the largest share of high fertility rates might not be explained by unmet need for contraception. On the contrary, some other works are bringing suggestive evidence that demand-side factors, such as income, may play a larger role than we have been thinking so far. So the main motive of this paper is the idea that women's demand function for children in a low-income and high-fertility setting requires further examination. We are trying to answer to two main research questions. The first one is, how do two major development programs aimed at improving income and wealth, which are business training and land titling programs, do impact fertility? And what mechanisms underlie women's fertility responds to an increase in their earnings and in household wealth in sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of empirical strategy, so we are conducting a secondary analysis of 6 data sets from impact evaluation conducted by the Gender Innovation Lab of the World Bank between 2009 and 2017. So this set of studies include 3 business training programs in Ethiopia and Togo, and 3 land titling programs in Benin, Ghana, and Rwanda. So this selection is based on 2 criteria. So first, we wanted that this impact had a positive and sizable impact on economic outcome, which are either profit or household assets. And we wanted at least 12 months between the intervention and follow-up, in order, of course, to observe the result of a fertility decision, which were made post-treatment. So regarding the design, they are all RCTs, except in Ghana, where it is an RDD. And concerning the sampling, we restrict the sample to women of reproductive age who are either married or in a relationship. So importantly, our results do not speak to the case of, to the impact of strengthening economic opportunity for adolescent girls. We're really focusing on so women already working, already married.
You have to close it.
Sorry?
You have to close the document and open it. Okay. No,
I totally closed it.
you have to close it.
Okay, sorry about that. So here you have a table summarizing the business training programs we are studying. So what this program have in common is to include a basic traditional training component, but also a psychological based dimension, fostering personal initiative, entrepreneurial spirit, etc. And they also have in common to have a strong positive impact on profit. So for the DOT and the PI, this program increased profit by 30% over the control group, and in the case of the one program, it increased profit and sales index by 0.20 standard deviation. For the land titling, so all the 3 programs are land demarcation and certification program, and the specificity of the Rwanda program is that it put a special emphasis on gender equality, since it granted husband and wives property rights on an equal footing. And both had a large impact on perceived and actual tenure security. Regarding the sampling, so the women on the study are in their 30s. Their number of children ranges from 2 to 3.5 in Benin. So, which means they are more or less in the middle of their reproductive life, since in these countries, the total fertility rates range from 4 in Rwanda to 4.8 in Benin. And the age gap is large. The women tend to be way younger than their spouse, and the age gap ranges from 10 years in the Ethiopia sample to 6 years younger in the Ethiopia world sample. In terms of identification strategy, we leverage the random assignment of this program in order to study the impact of an exogenous variation of earnings or household wealth on fertility. And we think it is a unique opportunity to circumvent usual endogeneity issues in the fertility income relation. So what we do is simply measuring an intent to treat effect of each intervention on the outcome fertility. And we used a standard specification with strata fixed effect. We cluster the standard error at the randomization level, and we include a set of baseline or time-invariant covariates. And importantly, we control for the number of children at baseline. So, what do we find? So, unexpectedly, we found strong positive average treatment effect on fertility. So, in this table, you have the average treatment effect on the number of children at baseline. So, for the dot treatment, for instance, the impact represents a 5% increase over the control group, which is a sizable impact if we have in mind the fact that the take-up was low, only 52%, and the fact that we only observe 3 months windows of fertility decision. We didn't find any effect in the Ethiopia whole sample, and in Togo we find a large effect as well, which represents a 69% increase over the control group, with a take-up which is higher, about 80%, and we also observe during a fertility decision during a longer period of time. So regarding the land titling programs, so we find a 5% and a 7% increase in Benin and Ghana respectively over the control group, and we find nothing in Rwanda. We also look at the effect on the likelihood to have had a child with treatment, and we find similar results, with especially large result in Togo, since women who receive the treatment are twice as likely to have had a child post-treatment. And importantly, in what we're doing as well is testing whether the coefficient at follow-up 1 and follow-up 2 are statistically different, and we cannot reject equality. So we think it is an argument in favor of an interpretation in terms of an impact on cumulative fertility and not only an impact on birth weighting. So, how can we explain that? So, we have in mind 3 main mechanisms. The first one would be simply the budget constraint hypothesis. So, the idea would be simply that the poorest share of the sample would be constrained in their demand for children, and the treatment generates a positive income shock, which relaxes the constraint, and therefore women can afford an additional child and increase the demand for children. In favor of this hypothesis, we have an heterogeneous effect of the treatment depending on whether women household belong to the subsample above or below a median of the household asset index. And it seems that women below the median seems to be driving the effect. Another point in favor of this hypothesis is the fact that already at baseline, wealthier women already had more children than the poorest women, as if so these women on the left-hand side of the distribution were budget constrained in their demand for children. One last interesting point is the fact that it seems that we're not observing a simple revenue effect at the household level, because in the case of Togo, we are able to compare the impact of the treatment depending on whether the recipient is women business owner or men business owner, because the sample is stratified by gender, and we only observe a positive effect on fertility when woman is the recipient of the program, as if what mattered in this decision is mainly her income, as if as well the financial responsibilities of children were relying on her. Our second main potential explanation is the whole age security motive. So we think that in a context where the age gap between spouses is common and large, widowhood is a likelihood event which might be anticipated during all women's reproductive life. So, and she might be incentivized to have a son because we're in a patrilineal context where customary laws exclude women from inheritance, and the only way for them to access tenure security if they lose their husband is to have a son. And we're also in a context which is patrilocal, so girls, daughters tend to move to the homes household, and therefore women are more likely to rely on their son than to rely on their daughter in the future, in their old age. So we think that in a context with no safety net, no pension system, and imperfect capital market, having a son might be the best strategy to secure long-term economic security. So to test this, so we look at heterogeneity depending on whether women had a son before treatment, at least one son. And the effect seems driven by women who had no son at baseline. So these are for the business training. And we observed the same pattern in Benin. So women with no son show a stronger fertility response to the treatment. And importantly, so in favor of this inheritance motive, we find heterogeneity depending on whether women as rivals. So by rivals, I mean children that the husband had in a previous or concomitant marriage and who are likely to claim the land or the property in general if the father died. So they are in competition for inheritance with the women. So we expect that the women who are the most at risk of disposition in case of widowhood are those women with no son and rivals. And actually we find the strongest response to the treatment on those women. So here you can see that women with no son at baseline and rivals at baseline have on average 0.8 more children than women in a control group who are in an analogous situation. So in the case of Ghana, we also find evidence of this inheritance motive, but in a matrilineal context, since as you know, in matrilineal regime, the father does not belong to the same matrikind of his wife, and therefore he cannot transfer his property to his children and his wife at his death. So widows can be left with nothing but their children. That's why the 1985 interstate law was passed to protect them. But this law, to be implemented, needed land formalization because it only applies to land which is acquired during marriage. So we think that this formalization treatment, this land titling program in Ghana we're studying, actually made this law enforceable on the land, and therefore it creates an incentive for women to have children in order to maximize inheritance. And we find actually an effect which is stronger among women whose husband belong to an ethnic group which is matrilineal, which is Akan. So finally, as I told you, we find a null effect for the Rwanda case, and we think it is the exception that proves the rules, because Rwanda is the only country where the program put an emphasis on gender equality, and therefore, since husband and wife were granted officially on an equal footing property right over the land, it did not create an incentive for women to have more sons or more children in order to secure the property right over the land. Our last explanation would be to consider that maybe the two previous explanations are not incompatible, but that they may be interacting in the situation in which this old age security motive is especially observed among the poorest share of the sample. So to explore this, we are trying to see whether we observe the sound pattern in both wealth groups. We are only able to test this for the dot treatment due to lack of power. And what we find is that the sound pattern seems to appear in both wealth groups, but it is way more salient in the group below the median. And therefore, it seems that women were with the strongest response to the treatment are those women with no son and below the household asset median. So we think such an interpretation would actually make a lot of sense because, of course, the poorest women are more likely to have less alternative resources in their old age, and they are also more likely to have been budget constrained in their demand for son before the program. We also thought of alternative mechanisms, and we think we will roll them out. So first, it could have been that the land titling programs extended household formalized land, which might have created a demand for more workforce, and therefore women could have increased their fertility in order to have more children working on their land. But since we find no effect in Rwanda, we don't think it is likely. It could have been as well that the increase in women income, thanks to business training, increased their bargaining power within the household, and that this would have allowed them to act on their preferences, and it would have allowed them to increase their fertility. But since in every context under study, women's desired family size is lower than men's desired family size, it is also unlikely. And finally, it might have been that thanks to the business trainings, women increased their productivity, which might have allowed them to free up time, which might have entailed them to make the decision to have a child at this moment, but we find no effect on labor supply, and if any, it is a positive effect. So we also think it is unlikely. So to conclude, we find a strong unintended positive impact of two common development programs on fertility. We think it is suggestive evidence that poor women demand for children might be budget constrained, and that women's lack of long-term economic security is an important driver of high fertility rates in sub-Saharan Africa. Finally, we think that this result carry important policy implication, since first, it's just that contrary to what we have been thinking, strengthening women's economic opportunities does not naturally reduce women's demand for children in the region. The fact that giving women stronger property rights is an important pathway for reducing fertility in sub-Saharan Africa. And also, we think our result also suggests that increasing provisioning for widowed and the elderly could be an important pathway toward reducing fertility in the region. Thank you.
No, vamos. So if there were a prize for ugly slides, I think I would win this one. So, so thanks a lot for this. I mean, I was very happy to read this paper on the fertility impact of development programs. I think, I mean, it's as I said, a very ambitious and well-executed analysis. It speaks to also a very important questions in the literature with very strong policy implication, including of unintended consequences of policies we have in mind. So I think it's it's a very, very important topic. I thought it was also a very clever use of secondary data, both RCTs and RDD. And really, all along the paper, I could really feel that the authors demonstrated a very good grasp of the context, whether it is about customary rules of inheritance, the interplay between customary rules and common law, and also the question of the preference for sons, which is, of course, like more subtle than India or China, but it's still, existent in Sub-Saharan Africa. And I also appreciated the consideration around the marriage dynamics with the different matrimonial lines. So all this, comes for a very rich paper and raises a lot of interesting questions. In terms of, the comments that I have, they are, I would say, like more organized about first, I would dive straight into, what's, the interpretation. I don't need to summarize what you've done. I mean, I think the presentation was very clear. And maybe also discuss somehow, how you position yourself compared to the literature and think more about, discussion of the contribution. So in terms of the interpretation and robustness of the results, so I feel like, somehow you put all the results for the different experiments on the same level in terms of what you're able to say and interpret. But I guess I would be a bit more cautious about that. So for instance, for the PI2GO results, so this is, in the table, you mentioned that you don't have the exact fertility of women. So you're taking the number of children under 5 in the household. And so because the custom of, having, fostering, is important, I guess, you may confound the effect of the increasing fertility of women in the program, plus, on top, the impact of potential fostering. So a suggestion for that would be, so I think, that the average age in your sample is around 38 for this one. So maybe if you have enough power, enough women who are closer to the end of their fertile life, maybe if you can zoom in on her and see whether you see an increase in the number of children in the household, as a result of treatment. So if it's the case, of course, they're probably more or less, they can still have children around 50, if you have some, but it's just less likely. So maybe if you see a difference with that, that could be a signal that there is some fostering happening here. And if not, probably you could be reassured further about that. About the Benin results, so you said yourself that, there is so you have like 2 periods that you observe women for the treatment, and you can't distinguish the effect at the first period from the second period, but the result at the second period are not significantly different from 0. So it's not completely reassuring, whereas for Ghana, you have some clear difference between the two, and you can make the difference. And it feels, like maybe in that respect, the Ghana results may be a bit more robust. And also, I think, for the Benin results, so you have this paper that you cite about Rossi and Rouanet, where they show, that in Benin in particular, you have a preference for variety in the sex composition of children. And so for me, it's not obvious how you can disentangle the difference between, when you look, at the impact of the treatment of women's fertility, you separate between women who have no son versus one who have at least one. And so for me, it's not obvious that you can make the difference between, needed a son for old age body versus a preference for variety in children for women, because of, the result that Rossi and Rouanet found. So again, so you don't show us any first stage result, and that's fine. You tell us that, the program increased women's income, but I'm just wondering, and you're showing intention to treat, and that's perfectly fine, but I'm still wondering, whether there is a clear consistency between women who are affected in the first stage or whose income is actually increasing, and women who are actually the ones who are changing their fertility behavior. So for instance, in Ghana, you say that women with low land increase their fertility as a response to the land titling program, but then why, what's going on in terms of their increase in income? It is an increase in income in the whole household, and then it has an impact on fertility, but then your contribution in the paper is about saying that you can actually identify the impact of women's increase in income. So I'm just wondering whether you can give more detail in the paper about who is changing the fertility behavior and whether it is consistent with, the women who are actually getting some extra income. I don't know if that's 100% clear. Maybe we can talk about it a bit. And it's kind of the same question for Benin. In the sense that you not only show that women who are heads of household are the ones who are getting some extra income for the program, but in the result that we find, are they the ones who are actually changing their fertility behavior? And if they are not, again, is it, a question of this indirect change, to say that some women are impacted indirectly by the increase in income, but then is it a whole package about the increased income in the household rather than the impact of the increase in income of the woman? In terms of mechanism, so you do a lot of testing, it's very rich, so I guess, but it's a preliminary draft, so maybe it's a cheap shot, so sorry about that one, but for sure we probably have to control for multiple hypothesis testing. When it comes to the labor demand aspect, so you say that you don't think that's an issue because then, but I also think that maybe you observe women's fertility quite early after the birth of the child for the change, so I guess, if you would expect some increase on child labor, you would need more time to actually see a difference. Having said that, to shut down what I just said, you can also say that when women are actually having children, they contribute to the lineage of the husband, and the husband is the one, managing who's working on each plot, and that includes the labor of the child. I'm sure there is some literature anthropology that says that in a more eloquent way. And finally, in terms of mechanisms, so you talk about, bargaining power. And I feel like it's hard to dismiss, first, in terms of empirically, because somehow, your results are still compatible with a potential increase in women's bargaining power. but still not enough to shift the power dynamics around fertility decisions. And then the second reason why I'm not completely at ease with, saying that the bargaining power dynamic is not happening is that you somehow, talk about how your result can talk to collective household models. But if you have a change in income, and if it's strong enough, it will change the Pareto weight, which is a proxy for the relative power of spouses in the household, which is definitely like a measure of bargaining power. So it's more a conceptual point, I would say. So feel free to dismiss it. But I guess that related to that, there is an untapped possibility here is that you may want to separate the impact of unfertility of a change in different distribution factors that determine the Pareto weights. Typically, income is one of them, but also potentially some non-cognitive skills that women are picking up during the training and that also could have an impact in their ability to negotiate with the husband. And for that, in the paper, you mentioned that in the Ethiopian One program, you have mentees and mentors, and the result that you find are actually on mentors who had an increase in income. But actually, you could use these mentees who had no increase in income, but still took part in the program, either as a placebo, saying, yeah, okay, maybe either, there is no increase in income and there will be no change in fertility and you can test that. Or you can say that maybe they are picking up some soft skills during the training, and that could also drive some of your results, but you test whether this is actually happening. You could actually use this subsample of women and see whether there is something going on. And very quickly, just, in terms of taking a step back about the contribution. So you say that one of the main contributions is taking the effect of the increase in income of the wife from accessing the labor market at some point compared to the previous literature. That's what you mentioned in your introduction. So I'm not sure what other channels and income you have in mind when you put that contribution forward in the introduction. Is it about some network effects? But I guess, that would also change when women are taking part in the business training as well. So I just mean that it would be easier for the reader if you spelled out what you meant in the introduction for that part of your contribution. And I think that it would be interesting to have a clearer discussion to reconcile your results with the paper of Rossi and Rouanet, because for Benin, as I said, there is a preference for variety that could be a confounder of your effect. But for Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Togo, they found no preference for sun in the fertility behavior of women. So I grant you that they are not looking at a potential shock in income and the response in fertility, but still, because they don't find this preference, I think it would be interesting to have more discussion about how you can reconcile what they find and the results that you find in your paper. Yeah, that's it.
These were great comments. Thank you so much. I don't know where to start.
Maybe I totally missed it, but so could you disentangle between the total fertility rate, how many kids this one will have, or is it just timing that is changing, that have their next kids at birth?
So we only observe fertility so after 16 months, so very short time. So we're not able to affirm that we are observing effects on fertility. We think fertility because we need this test between the 1 and 2, but still it's the effect that we observe in 3 years and
And sorry again, I don't remember the ages of this woman, but can you check whether it's the late fertility that is driving the results, or the early one, like first kids is arriving earlier, or is it like the first one, or whatever?
I mean, truly see
Or not having already next kids.
So what we do today is as I was saying, which is check having interaction and there is for the affecting test actually. But yes, we could test actually the usually but what you see was so simple, so
Yeah, so what was the rationale behind excluding women who are neither married nor in a relationship? Because this could be a very specific subset, maybe those people who are most prone to fertility, which is not really demanded. But
this policy refers to isolate relation, that actually that women who are married yet we would be able to distinguish their decision ID they're not different from marriage or fertility. So we just wanted to be clear, just to keep this very, very working.
But for those in the relationship, you also don't know whether it's the same relationship, right? So you use married and in a relationship as a baseline.
Yes. Just so that a person could differentiate to get on this.